Thanks, Greg. Nice job with the slide issues there, too. For this first session, as Greg said, we're going to talk about the application of transferable exclusivity vouchers to the antimicrobial market. As I mentioned, this is an area that's gotten a lot of attention in recent years with bipartisan proposals introduced in Congress. We are going to have a kickoff presentation for this session from Amanda Jezik. We're very pleased to have Amanda with us today. She's the Vice President for Public Policy and Government Relations at the Infectious Disease Society of America. She's going to give an overview, and then we'll go into the panel discussion. Amanda?
Good morning. I'm very pleased to be here, and thanks so much to the Duke Margolis Center for inviting me to speak today. So IDSA, for folks who may not be familiar, represents over 10,000 infectious diseases physicians and scientists, and antibiotic resistance and the urgent need for new antibiotics has been a chief priority of ours for well over a decade now, because our physician members, some of whom are here today, I'm very pleased to say, have been seeing increasing numbers of patients who have very serious life-threatening infections that are resistant to all or nearly all of our existing arsenal of antibiotics. So this is something that we are very committed to continue working on. So I've been asked, as Mark said, to talk specifically about one potential incentive, transferable exclusivity vouchers. So I'll give kind of an overview of what this concept is, and it's come up in a variety of different flavors and a variety of proposals over the years. I'll talk a bit about sort of the pros and cons of using something like this, some of the ways that we could address the key challenges that would arise for this type of an incentive. And then I'll kind of close by talking a bit about the political environment and the policy context that I think will really impact the feasibility of moving this type of an incentive forward. So the basic concept of a transferable exclusivity voucher is that a company that receives FDA approval for a new antibiotic that meets some set of criteria would then obtain a voucher that they can use to extend the exclusivity period of another drug, likely a drug that would have much more profitability than the antibiotic. For a company that is unable to use that voucher, such as a small company that maybe doesn't have other drugs, they could sell that to another company. And this is a piece that we think is critically important to allow something like this to be usable and a productive incentive for small companies as well as large. There are a lot of different details that would need to be considered. What antibiotics would be eligible? Would it be all QIDPs, antibiotics that meet an unmet need? How would we define unmet needs? A lot to think about there. How much extended exclusivity are we willing to give some additional drug? 6 months, a year, 3 years, 5 years? Again, people have a variety of ideas on this. Would there be any kinds of limits in terms of what kind of drugs can be used for this exclusivity voucher? Would it have to be a new drug or a drug that's been on the market for a while? Would there be any other kinds of guardrails in place there? And then lastly, what's the impact on stewardship? And this is a question that IDSA asks for really any kind of incentive that we are considering. We want to make sure that incentives are very well aligned with stewardship. So to my knowledge, the first time that this idea was proposed was actually, somewhat fittingly, I suppose, a Duke University professor who suggested this back in 2003 as a pull-based incentive, afford companies a defined period of market exclusivity that could be applied to some other compound. He did not think of this specific to antibiotics, but just to facilitate R&D in any sort of area where we have a societally desirable but unprofitable medicine, and certainly antibiotics fit that. IDSA included this in our Bad Bugs, No Drugs report in 2004. The way we sort of looked at it, our particular lens was actually as a 2-year patent extension. We did put some kind of requirements around that the new antibiotic would treat a targeted pathogen, so not any antibiotic would be eligible. We also put in place a requirement that companies would then the company receiving the exclusivity voucher would have to commit 10 to 20% of their profits derived from that new exclusivity to an additional targeted antibiotic R&D. The President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, or PCAST, included this concept in their 2014 report, which hopefully folks are quite familiar with. So they did, look at this from the perspective of kind of pros and cons, recognizing this would leave innovation decisions up to the free market. One of the key pros that they identified is that this would not require direct appropriation from Congress, which, given Congress's persistent inability to pass appropriations bills on time, I think this is something that really something that we believe is a very strong positive for something like this. But then on the flip side, they did ask, the question that, well, why should a patient who's taking a statin drug or some other type of drug have to bear the financial burden of incentivizing antibiotic R&D? And we may be able to answer that question and talk about the societal importance of antibiotics, but this is an important question that I think needs to be considered. So this has come up on Capitol Hill, a congressional hearing also in 2014 focused on antibiotic incentives. Johnson & Johnson included this type of proposal in their testimony that day, talked about how this type of idea has been successful for orphan drugs with a pediatric exclusivity program. And they were also looking at types of guardrails that could be put in place to make this more politically feasible and workable for the rest of the market. So, for example, you not being allowed to apply the voucher to on-market pharmaceutical products for which fewer than 4 years of patent life remain. And also they really emphasize, and this is something else that IDSA believes very strongly in, that this incentive alone is not a silver bullet. This really needs to be considered as part of a broader package of policy incentives. So we did try to move something like this on Capitol Hill just last year. Folks might be familiar with the 21st Century Cures Act. The very first draft of this bill that came out did include a proposal for conveyed exclusivity. It was bipartisan. Congressman Shimkus from Illinois and Congressman Gene Green from Texas. And it would have allowed up to 12 months of conveyed exclusivity that a company would receive for a QIDP to be transferred to a different product. And it puts a couple of guardrails in place requiring companies to contribute some of their profits to the NIH for antimicrobial resistance research, as well as contributing some profits to patient assistance programs. This was only in the very first draft of 21st Century Cures and got stripped out very quickly due to a lot of protesting, largely from Democrats who serve on the Energy and Commerce Committee. And it really hasn't come up in Congress for serious consideration since that time. So some of the key pros, as I mentioned, does not require upfront government funding or annual congressional action. This is a big plus. It is, in a sense, while it's not what we think of as delinkage, it is delinked from the sales or use of antibiotics. A company, gets this reward regardless of how much drug they sell or how much is used. And this could potentially be a powerful incentive for companies. Drawbacks and some of the potential solutions, and this has come from conversations that have already occurred with the Duke-Margolis Center. There's obviously the big concern that these vouchers would increase costs in other areas of healthcare for whatever drugs these vouchers get applied to. So we could find some way to cap the voucher in either value or duration. Concern that this could negatively affect the generic market. Potential solution to that is to only award the voucher for new drugs and not drugs that have already been on the market for a long time. And this is something that's been incorporated in previous versions of this idea as well. Concerned that this might not do enough to be aligned with stewardship and to really encourage stewardship. So I think there have been some discussions about what else could be done to build some better stewardship principles into an incentive like this. As I said at the beginning, there's still the outstanding question of what antibiotics are going to be targeted. I think there are concerns, certainly from IDSA's perspectives, that QIDP may be too broad for something like this. And do we really want a more narrow set of criteria for antibiotics that meet the most unmet medical needs in order to receive this kind of an incentive? We also recognize that the sale of this drug would still be, fee-for-service, and how do you, again, kind of get to better stewardship principles with an incentive like this? One other approach to consider, and this is something that Greg mentioned earlier, is this could potentially not just be an incentive in and of itself, but it could be used as a funding mechanism for market entry rewards, which I know the next panel is going to cover. So under a model like this, rather than a company that develops the new antibiotic getting the exclusivity voucher, you'd simply step back and have the federal government say, we're going to sell an exclusivity voucher to potentially the highest bidder, and that company gets to use it on whatever drug they want, and they don't have to develop an antibiotic. The federal government then uses the proceeds from selling that exclusivity voucher to fund the market entry rewards for more of a true delinkage approach. There certainly would be some political hurdles to doing this as well, but I think it is another interesting approach that is worthy of discussion. So let's talk a little bit about the political environment. There is a lot of momentum for addressing antibiotic resistance right now and for incentivizing the development of new antibiotics. So as challenging as this is, and as many of the details as there are to figure out, this is the time to be having that conversation. We have a tremendous opportunity to capitalize on the momentum from the UN meeting and the political declaration, from all of the reports put forward by CDC, PCAST, the UK AMR review, all of the media coverage, all of the great work of the PACCARB, the Presidential Advisory Council on antibiotic resistance. We really need to try to capitalize on this momentum and try to figure out as a unified voice what are the incentives that we can agree to and try to advance. We also have to recognize that while all of that conversation is going on antibiotic resistance, there is, I'd say, an equally powerful or perhaps even more powerful conversation going on around prescription drug costs and a lot of concern about rising prescription drug costs for a wide variety of different kinds of drugs. So any incentive that is going to potentially contribute to this problem or even be viewed as contributing to this problem is going to have some serious obstacles in terms of political feasibility, messaging, things like that. I will say it's been at least my experience on Capitol Hill that Democrats have been more concerned about prescription drug costs than Republicans, or at least more outspoken about it. So we can consider what the outcome of last night's elections mean for all of this, but I do think this is still a pressing public concern that we'll need to keep in mind. In terms of the policy context, from IDSA's point of view, it's really important to remember that this conversation is not happening in a vacuum, and there is a much broader effort going on, not only to incentivize antibiotic development, but to really combat antimicrobial resistance through a large multi-prong approach. We do believe that the push incentives, like additional funding for BARDA, for NIH, tax credits, are critical. We don't think that pull incentives alone are going to solve this problem. We also know that we need to work with FDA on better regulatory approaches. On the legislative side, we're extremely excited about LPAD, the limited population antibacterial drug, which we hope to get across the finish line this year. So we do think that there are a lot of moving parts here that we need to consider. We also recognize that next year Congress will have to do PDUFA reauthorization again. This does provide a really good opportunity for us to move forward with some package of incentives. So again, this is the right time to be having this conversation. So again, just some final thoughts. We do believe that multiple push and pull incentives are going to be needed. Transport exclusivity vouchers could very well be a piece of that solution, but we certainly don't think that they are a silver bullet in and of themselves. And more broadly than that, we can't just work on incentives or just think about incentives. And as we're having this conversation, we need to always think about how each of these potential incentives impacts use and stewardship. And we need to also be pushing for this broader approach to not just incentivize antibiotic development, but to ensure that we have robust surveillance systems, which will be critically important for helping us determine where is the unmet need and what do our targets need to be. We need to continue doing a better job with confection prevention and control. We need more diagnostic tests and stewardship. And lastly, we need a robust ID workforce to do all of this work, to do the research, to take care of the patients and run the stewardship programs. So I know I probably have spent the last 10 minutes or so talking about all of the challenges to doing this work and advancing these kinds of policies, but we would say that inaction is not an option. We need to find a way together to overcome these hurdles. As Tatiana so poignantly shared with us real people are suffering and dying as a result of these infections, and they need new antibiotics now, and they're not going to get them unless we figure out some good incentives. So I'm really delighted to see so many folks in the room today to work on these policies with us. Thank you very much.
Amanda, thanks very much for your presentation. So I'd like to turn now to some initial comments from our panelists on this topic of a transferable exclusivity voucher to help provide a strong pull incentive, a stronger economic reward for the development and bringing to market of effective new antimicrobials. And very pleased to be joined for this discussion by Robert Guidos from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, Brad Spellberg from LA County University, from the University of Southern California, LA County USC Medical Center, Barrett Thornhill as well from the Antibiotic Innovation Alliance. We're just going to start with brief comments from all of you, and in addition to any major comments you have on this topic, if you have a little bit more of an introduction you'd like to give about your connection and work related to, or your organization's connection and work related to this topic, that would be great as well. So, Bob?
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Although I work for the FDA and certainly the issues around the challenges in antibiotic development, regulation, approval are very much a priority for us. We do not take at the FDA a position on policies around incentivizing drug development in the context we're talking about here with the transferable voucher. We really look at that as Dr. Woodcock, my boss, who heads up the Center for Drugs, has testified many times before Congress, saying that really it's up to Congress to be examining the trade-offs between one incentive over another, and we're happy to advise and provide our opinion from a technical perspective, but really we're not able to speak. So I'm here really to talk, I guess, or been asked to come to speak more on an individual basis because of my past work with the Infectious Diseases Society of America. I was there for 13 years until about 2013, and was involved in the development of the Bad Bugs, No Drugs report that came out in 2004. And the impetus behind that report was the physician leaders at IDSA realized that there was a tremendous problem in the antibiotic pipeline. They were seeing problems with their patients, but we also recognized that there were no advocacy groups, patient advocacy groups, that were getting behind or ever going to be mobilized in this area because of the nature of these types of infections. They either with antibiotics will heal quickly, and or patients will succumb quickly, and so patients don't become vested in the problem. So we took it upon ourselves to work on this Bad Bugs, No Drugs report, and in doing so, reached out to many different types of drug companies, including large companies, small companies, medium companies. Among the large ones, it was Abbott, Eli Lilly, J&J, Merck, Pfizer. And in fact, several of the doctors and myself went up to meet with Hank McKinnell, who was then the CEO of Pfizer in New York, to talk about the types of incentives that would help to keep a company like Pfizer in antibiotic discovery and development. And since that period of time, unfortunately, Pfizer seems to have left. Can't speak for the company, but it seems they have pulled out of the discovery phase of development. And what was communicated to us during that meeting with Hank McKinnell, and perhaps it was because this was 2003, around the time that the report you're talking about, although I thought it had been talked about previously, but that might be the linkage. He mentioned this wildcard patent extension or exclusivity extension as as really, from his perspective, the only thing that would probably keep large companies like Pfizer in the game. And so that was one of the reasons, after speaking with him and talking amongst our leadership and reaching out to other companies, that we included this wildcard extension as a critical priority in the Bad Bugs No Drugs report. Didn't take very long after putting that report out that we started getting feedback from people who didn't think this was the best approach. They saw it as an inefficient type of incentive, putting the burden on patients and Medicaid and Medicare, and that might use drugs in another area, and it would be hugely inefficient and costly, and there were better ways of spending those dollars. And in fact, I think, I have to go back and look at the year of the transcript, but there was actually a Senate hearing where I think I specifically recall Senator Schumer speaking of this this concept as a boondoggle for industry. And that kind of put the kibosh on. And in fact, IDSA put these proposals out as recommendations for policymakers to consider. We didn't necessarily know, we said in the report we didn't have all the answers, but people needed to start discussing these types of incentives, and happy that 12 years later we're sitting here talking about this concept still. But it's not going to be, it's going to be a very challenging type of concept to move forward. Obviously, it's significant in its size. It was enough that Pfizer, that Dr. McKinnell put it forward, and in fact, Pfizer continued to do modeling over the years that they shared with IDSA up until probably 2012, before they left and started closing down their facilities that were focused in discovery in this area. They had work groups that were focused on modeling different types of incentives so that they, could help to influence policymakers in this space. They did share that information with us. It didn't include. So obviously, this was a large incentive. It didn't include the guardrails that are being discussed now. Potentially, those guardrails are, if structured appropriately, are such that they would allow for greater support to be built. So I think those are just my opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bob. Brad?
Well, I'm not here representing anybody. The county takes no position on this, and University of Southern California takes no position on this. I'm here as Bob's junior partner. So I have to admit to having a fond bias towards wildcard patent exclusivity, because it's something, as Bob mentioned, we've worked on for a long time at IDSA, dating back to 2003 and 4. And then about almost 10 years ago, we published an economic model that suggested that it might actually, from a societal perspective, pay for itself. Because if you have drugs become available that decrease the cost of health care by making you more able to treat highly resistant infections, you could offset the extra costs that by excluding generic availability would create. But that actually raises a really important point, which is when we're talking about incentives, the question is who's the payer? And our healthcare system is very complicated, and I think that there is a tendency, especially amongst physicians, but amongst non-physician people as well, to not quite understand who's paying for what. So for example, when I look in the PCAST statement that it isn't fair to push the costs of statins onto patients, patients don't pay for their statins by and large, right? They may have a copay, but taxpayers pay for the statins. And so the cost is already being distributed across taxpayers. So if you're going to really look at the cost benefit of something from a societal perspective, you have to understand who the payers are. And you have to look very carefully at who's paying the bills and how those costs are being distributed. Over the last few years, I personally have started to shift my thinking on incentives. And I will say that I'm generally not as in favor of pull incentives as I once was, both because I've gained a greater understanding of how the economic modeling within pharma is done, both by working with Dr. Rex and also the London School of Economics, and also because I've been disappointed as a clinician, as a hospital leader who sits on P&T committees and has to pay the bills, with how industry has responded to unmet need, and with how government has not really understood how unmet need changes. And so we've seen a flood of Me Too drugs tackling areas that are not needed. This is, I think, both on the shoulders of industry, which is understandable. Industry wants a safe, inexpensive path to get their drugs to market at low risk. And if you're going to try to hit unmet need, that's really hard to do. So what do you end up doing? You flood the market with MRSA skin drugs. I got a ton of MRSA skin drugs. I don't need any more MRSA skin drugs. I think that regulatory has similar pressures. It's risky for them to approve drugs for unmet need. It's safe for them to approve drugs on pathways that have been used many, many times. So I've become somewhat skeptical that, and then the other issue is the issue of time discounting. I alluded to economic modeling within industry. What are we incentivizing? What I want to incentivize is discovery. Pull incentives, by and large, are going to incentivize late-stage acquisitions because they kick in so far away from the initial discovery of a new scaffold that the economic forces of discounting greatly erode the value, especially since discovery has moved away from big pharma. Big pharma uses a 10 to 11% annual discount rate. Biotechs use a 20 to 30% annual discount rate. Apply a 30% annual discount rate over 13 years, and you will erode 99% of the value of the incentive. So what's going to happen is, it's not the company that says, hey, I want to start a new discovery program. It's the company who says, hey, I want to buy a drug that's in phase 2 trials. Oh, that pull incentive looks great. So what are we trying to incentivize? When you add that into the fact that I've been disappointed with which scaffolds have been pushed forward by industry and which pathways have been used by regulatory, I'm not at all convinced that pull incentives are the best way to go. Of the pull incentives, my favorite, possibly partly for sentimental reasons, is wildcard exclusivity. I do think that the advantage of wildcard exclusivity is that it does distribute the cost across society. It isn't on the shoulders of the person taking the statin. It's on the costs of Medicare and Medicaid and private insurers, so it gets distributed across people's insurance premiums and across the tax dollars that go in to fund government insurance. So I think that does make sense.
All right, Brad, thanks very much. Barrett?
Hi, how are you? So I'm Barrett Thornhill. I represent the Antimicrobial Innovation Alliance. We are a group of 13 pharmaceutical manufacturers, and including in alphabetical order, I'll try to do this: Achaogen, Allergan, Astellas, AstraZeneca, Basilea, Johnson & Johnson, Microbion, Spiro, Seres, Shionogi, Tetraphase, and Zavante. And so our group really has been focused on trying to reward and rebalance the economics for the antibiotic marketplace. There was a very smart man who once said, the traditional capitalistic market has not supported antimicrobial development, it has collapsed. Very smart guy. So we've been involved in this, and our sort of focus, and I'll come to why we're supporting this idea. Our focus has been based on 3 principles. First, we're focused on the most serious threats. As Dr. Gaddis has said, Mr. Gaddis has said, and Dr. Spilber has said, we're trying to focus on the most critical areas of need. It may be even more serious and unmet medical need, truly critical areas of infections. Second, we want to be balanced in our approach. We work in a political body that is multifaceted and many different actors, many different players. And so politics matter. I think we saw that last night. Costs matter quite a bit when you're trying to push policy on Capitol Hill. And also stewardship matters, and the considerations for the patients and the payers matter quite a bit. Second, any incentive we work on has to be valuable. We sort of have a new mentality of no more gains. The GAIN Act was a helpful piece of policy, but it did not provide the shot in the arm that industry is looking to see here to get people back into space. So it has to be valuable. I'm not sure we have a level, but it needs to be several hundreds of millions of dollars worth of incentives for us to be focused on it. And sort of last, we need to understand that, I think that's really 3, focus, balance, and valuable. So when we look at that basis, there's really 2 incentives, maybe 3, that meet that criteria. The first is reimbursement reform. The situation in the hospitals where they're simply not getting reimbursed by Medicare for purchasing the better drugs, where they can do their own cost-effective analysis, is a real challenge. Second is the Exclusivity Advance Award. I'm unaware of a single better incentive that provides the economics and can do it in a balanced way with the appropriate guardrails. The last is some level of tax reform or perhaps additional market entry awards. These are all things that I think we're interested in working on. They're definitely more longer term, but they could be very valuable in the future if this marketplace continues to deteriorate. So I think we are major supporters of the Exclusivity Conveyance Award. Again, I think it meets all the criteria. It provides the substantial amount of net present value calculations. It changes the equation regarding peak sales and estimated rates of return, which I know which drive many of the board level decisions that companies go through. So that's what our incentive is. We do believe in guardrails. So the guardrails that we're sort of thinking about first are notice and transparency. You need to be able to identify the products early in advance and ensure that the generic marketplace and the payer marketplace understand where these incentives could be levied. Second, there should be a limited period of time. I think right now our basis is the award should be no more than 12 months. It could be less even, but 12 months seems to provide if you do an NPV calculation, the appropriate amount of return for the antimicrobial developer. Second, there should be a very tight eligibility. To address some of the considerations that have been raised, we would support having a new body housed under HHS, call it the Critical Need Antimicrobial Committee, that's able to quickly and rapidly address the infections and the pathogens out there right now. Have guys like Dr. Spellberg and Mr. Gaidos involved that can rapidly say, this is where we need drugs. Not now, maybe in 5 years' time, maybe in 10 years' time, but this is where we need drugs. And have those rewards structured accordingly. So only truly the most critical need manufacturers the most critical need infections being treated by the most critical need products are the ones being incentivized for development. I think that would keep things very, very small. This would not be a boondoggle with Mr. Chuck Schumer's terms. We want to keep this as efficient as possible. I do think the economic costs are rightfully borne by society at large. There's clearly a political situation where people think it could be applied to the next big blockbuster drug, and you know what? That's where it should be, and the cost should be borne accordingly. We do need to take into consideration the patient's impact here. I think there are certain ways to address how the particular patient and their own cost sharing could be impacted by the extension of exclusivity of their drug by 1 year. There are market forces that could minimize that. But I think there is no better incentive right now to get a Pfizer back in the game, to keep AstraZeneca from in the game as much as possible, to keep Allergan investing in this space, to keep Genentech, Roche focused on this area. So that's our focus. There are other push incentives that matter quite a bit. There's other pull incentives that could be very helpful, but I think this is the best one we have right now to get the job done. I do think this is passable. I do think Congress, in 2017, could very well enact this kind of award, and we're eager to work with all stakeholders to shape it appropriately, to be balanced, focused, and valuable to patients, hospitals, as payers, as well as manufacturers.
All right, Barrett, thank you. And again, thanks to all of our panelists for what is already a rich discussion of some of the both technical and practical and political issues raised by this proposal. I'd like to get the further discussion going about this by taking up some of the points that you all raised. And maybe begin by starting with a further discussion of just how important this is. Amanda, you talked about, and we talked earlier today about the need for multiple incentives kind of at every stage of antimicrobial development to address a long set of challenges all across that spectrum. Brad, I took your evolving thought, emphasized, I think, much more of a push towards the early stage issues. So I'd like to maybe get a little bit further discussion, maybe back and forth about that. How important is it to have incentive that I think, to Brad's point, probably is going to make a bigger difference once you're at stage 2 after you're past those initial discovery and early development phases when the path to market isn't quite so far off or so uncertain that it would have that big discounting. Is that still important? And it seemed like there's a bit of divergence of views on that. Amanda, maybe we'll start with you, and then I'd very much like to hear from the other panelists too.
Sure. I don't think this is an either-or kind of situation. We would say all of the above. We absolutely need the kinds of incentives that Brad was talking about to incentivize early-stage discovery. The scientific challenges for new drugs that will really address the most critical unmet needs are tremendous. So we want to incentivize innovation. We want to incentivize the next crazy, exciting, out-of-the-box idea. And we absolutely need more of the push-style incentives to do that. At the same time, we also need to do something that's going to get the Pfizers and the Johnson & Johnsons and the other big companies to really be more heavily invested, both, again, on early stage and on the late stage and actually
why
bringing
aren't
drugs to
the
market.
small companies enough? Can you say a little bit more about that?
I think the small companies face a lot of economic challenges trying to draw, venture capitalists and investment from other sources. The regulatory hurdles are tremendous, and the ability to actually do a clinical trial, being able to have the resources that a large company can bring to the table, I think is really critical to be able to move the pipeline in the direction that it needs to be.
Other thoughts on this?
Well, I see. I mean, I represent very small micro-cap companies as well as larger ones. It's a very challenging environment to raise sufficient capital and find those right investors that are willing to put up with enormous risks and then know that the light at the end of the tunnel is pretty dim right now. So they're banking on something that could be beyond reality even. And the challenges are dire. So I think that the larger companies obviously have greater risk tolerances. They can afford greater losses. Their role in this is more important. I think this speaks to the non-dilutive role, the non-dilutive funding that BARDA and others have been putting up. Hugely influential, almost required at this stage of the game to support development that's going on in small companies. So there is a tremendous amount of innovation going, but without current government support and without continued government support or some sort of light at the tunnel growing larger, I don't see how this current model is totally sustainable. There's just too many risks, and the rewards are growing. I mean, you're talking about peak sales of less than $500 million per product. That's ridiculous. So if you're an investor or you're a company and you're making these board-level decisions on where to put your resources, and this is not a very attractive field, I'd even question the logic of people that are putting the money into it. It's almost anathema to capitalistic markets. So we have to address that, and unfortunately, I mean, I wish we didn't have to come up with major incentives like this that could be disruptive to other therapeutic classes. I wish we didn't have to, but we are at that stage in the game where there's not much left. We have 2 or 3 assets that are worth a poot in phase 3, and then we have 6 to 8 years where we have nothing. Brad's going to have nothing. In the 20s, we're going to have serious crisis in our hands because we're going to not have any assets. FDA can do all they want to speed through drugs, but it's still not going to be enough. We simply don't have enough in phase 1 and phase 2 that are going to be able to challenge these gram-negative infections that we're going to see. And that's where I get truly very, very worried. So, and I think the hospital administrators, the folks at cancer hospitals, transplant centers are worried now, and that's going to be shifting more to these other tertiary medical centers.
Brad?
Yeah, so just to expand on a couple of the points with which I agree. Small companies tend to have their fates attached to one molecule. And if that molecule goes up in flames, the company goes up in flames with it. So their risk tolerance and, as you said, their ability to raise venture capital, very limited. Their venture capital is not going to put money into a innovative, new challenge, the disruptive, whatever. And I, again, from personal experience, have been disappointed repeatedly to see molecules that could have been developed for unmet need instead got developed for MRSA skin infections because that's the only way they could get their investors to put money into the small company. On top of that, I was on the Pfizer ad board when they shut down. When you put dozens and dozens of scientists across multiple disciplines together in a room, backed by capital with a pipeline, you get an entirely different quality of outcome than when you've got a company that's got 5 employees and is outsourcing all the work and is backed by VC people. Tom Parr once compared to Al Pacino's character from, what's the movie where he was the cocaine lord in Miami?
Scarface, I believe.
There you go. Yeah, Scarface, right? They want a 40% return on investment in 3 years, right? That is not a productive way for us. This is not, antibiotics are a societal trust. We have a societal responsibility to have effective antibiotic therapy available for our patients. I am sorry that I have over time evolved the belief that the for-profit model has simply failed us in this space. And if I had $2 billion to spend, I would not spend it on a prize. I would put it into a nonprofit who could look at a $500 million peak sales and go, that sounds great, and use the revenue that they generate to reinvest in discovery, which is what I want to incentivize, not late-stage acquisition.
Bob?
So I agree with everyone, all the panelists. Certainly, as Amanda has mentioned, others have mentioned, there is a need for a combination of solutions here that will span across all different types of companies, and as well in the diagnostic space, as it has been pointed out. I feel compelled to talk about the CARB initiative, the Combating Antimicrobial Resistant Bacterial Initiative, that the President announced in 2014, a national strategy and an action plan that's come out that's supporting many of the activities, around discovery and supporting moving the pipeline forward. There's recently out of that CARB initiative came the accelerator that BARDA is supporting and working with outside groups on, and including European groups, that I think is going to be helpful. Obviously, there's going to be a need for continued funding towards that effort to build it out over time. I think that is going to be just another adding to the incentives that are in place at BARDA now, but that continue to need to grow. I would say from FDA's perspective, Dr. Cox is here, Ed Cox is here from the Office of Antimicrobial Products. He and his team are doing everything they can to try to break down regulatory barriers that have existed previously, but I think are from what we hear from industry, we've made a lot of progress over the past 5 to 7 years in trying to help, particularly in the areas of unmet needs. So there's a lot of activities already underway. Certainly there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Well, if we do have time, I would like to come back to this issue of how much is needed on sort of the back end of development to get through taking a promising compound, really proving that it does work well enough and getting it out reliably. But there are a few other topics that we also were brought up in your initial comments I'd like to get to as well. One of those was around which drugs get this would get this extra incentive for getting to market. I think, Barrett, you talked in a little bit of specificity about the mechanism for awarding it, kind of a government entity within HHS, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about how broad you think this effort might be. Barrett, I think you also mentioned that gain was not big enough in magnitude. We also had there's also been some studies showing that if you look at the drugs that are getting the gain incentive, it's not quite the ones that are at the really high end of the priority list. So I guess any comments you all have about mechanism for doing it, but especially making sure that this mechanism did go forward, how the transferable exclusivity would get targeted to the right drugs.
Right. I think that's a very important point, and I think we've learned from GAIN. So how do you find that right group of drugs? And this is very theoretical at times. What's going to be the leading infection in 10 years' time? What are going to be the pathogens causing such? Where is resistance growing the most? So a lot of it is guesswork to some degree, but that's required to do. So I think a flexible body that can rapidly review products and designate them kind of like orphan drugs happen now, and can provide that award upon licensure should they be indicated to treat and likely to treat certain infection types, I think is the best we can do. And perhaps a part of some of the legislation we're interested in drafting would have a look back. So in 5 years' time, let's look back and see how we've done. Perhaps even sunset the whole program if you need to. Let's really review it and see and make sure that the rewards we're providing match up to the type of pathogens that we're trying to really drive innovation towards. That's one way to do it. I think it should be housed in HHS. I think it should involve the best minds of our time in the infectious disease space, from those that are developing drugs to those that are regulating drugs to those that are really seeing these infections on their front line. I think they know best, not us. There's always a degree of lobbying that goes on in this town, thankfully for me. But I'd like to make this group as immune to lobbying as possible. I don't want to be lobbying Congress to go petition for X drug to be awarded this. So how can we immunize this to the greatest degree? I think, Mark, you've served in the administration and maybe going back, I don't know. So I'd love to maybe work with you guys to figure out how we can address this to really create as neutral, balanced, and focused a group as humanly possible. The PCAST reports and that group started it. The CDC has done great work here. So I think we have the foundation for such to rapidly get this going. I don't want to create a group that 3 years down the road and they have working groups and yada, yada, yada. It's the same people in the same rooms doing this over and over again. Let's get going. I think that's really critical to show how we can do this.
Other thoughts about this?
I haven't known Barrett for very long. I got an email from you last week, right? But I like you, Barrett. You definitely need I like the idea of a group. The group needs to be able to make decisions and change the priority scale in real time as needed and not have to go through committee, congressional committee. GAIN actually has one major strength. If you have an off-patent drug, GAIN is extremely valuable. The problem with GAIN economically is that the data exclusivity runs concurrent with the patent. So if it was actually patents and not data exclusivity, I think many more companies probably would get much more value out of it. But for those companies that have old drugs, GAIN was quite valuable. But it was clear, the QIDP is clearly overly expansive. And frankly, if you put 10 people in a room that were qualified, they could come out with a list in about an hour. In fact, that includes 30 minutes for tea, right? The areas of unmet need right now really are not that difficult to come up with. The hard part is to project out the coming 5 to 10 years. We actually have numerous CRE drugs in development now. So whereas 5 years ago, CRE would have been at the top of the list, it probably isn't at the top of the list anymore because you project out. Gonorrhea was near the top of the list a few years ago. There's a bunch of gonorrhea drugs now. They're not approved yet, but they're going to be approved or likely to be approved. So the hard part is just projecting forward 10 years into the future. But I think that a group of 10 people in a room could do that in an hour. Wouldn't be that hard.
Other thoughts on this topic? Oh, yeah, go ahead, Amanda.
So I was just going to say, we think that the idea of the group makes a lot of sense, and certainly you wouldn't want any kind of a static list. You wouldn't want something like this, enshrined in statute, anything like that. I think the kind of key areas here are to balance, the flexibility to rapidly update something as priorities change, but also the ability to give companies the predictability that they need so they don't feel as though goalposts are kind of changing on them at the last minute. And certainly this approach sounds as though it would meet both of those.
Right, that's key, and I think, Mark, and Bob too, the orphan drug designation process kind of works pretty well, where you can apply early on, and if licensed, you get this sort of reward. I think that would provide the stability a company needs to have as they go through development, not to know they're on track to do such, and that's going to keep them focused on medical needs and make sure their drug doesn't shift halfway through the course to some outpatient MRSA use, and that's what we're seeing right now.
All right, there's been a good discussion here of the mechanisms to get this approach to work for high-priority drugs to get them to market. As you've heard, some of the concerns that have come up about this proposal also relate to the key policy goals and the key public health goals once the drug is on the market. In particular, we talked some about the importance of appropriate use and stewardship of a drug like these once they are available, and also, I agree that there are some challenges in getting through the later stages of development and getting through the approval process. It's also challenging to keep a drug reliably produced, available, and on the market when needed. Any thoughts about how this proposal can not only provide reward for high-priority antimicrobials for getting to market, but addressing those issues of appropriate use, stewardship, and just reliable, the manufacturer reliably being there to continue to produce the product?
Sure. I think it's a great thing to add in to any piece of legislation some degree of stewardship. From one standpoint, though, those that look at legislation like CBO and others, I think, don't realize the degree that infectious disease doctors already take in terms of appropriate use and in really using tremendous amounts of stewardship. And I'm talking more about the academic medical centers and tertiary hospitals. I'm not talking about critical access hospitals and rural hospitals and others. I'm really talking about the folks that are seeing these infections up front. They're doing a great job right now, but I'm happy and eager to put in additional requirements to ensure that the drug manufacturer lives up to their responsibilities, whether it's REMS or tracking, unilevel tracking, surveillance, making sure the hospital participates in NHSN or whatever the best level of stewardship is, without putting too much of a burden on them to do it appropriately, incentivize them as well, I think would be, is totally proper and prudent. Again, I don't think you're going to see too many drugs that are going to meet sort of this criteria, critical need. So it's not going to be too onerous, for the majority, but ensuring, stewardship is very, very helpful. Because I think once you have that reward, the companies are less inclined to go market it towards MRSA and other infectious diseases. And that's the real challenge is if you create that light at the tunnel, you allow the company to reorient its risk-reward balance and focus where the true critical need is and look entirely for the patients and where the hospital administrators are clamoring for product.
One of my dearest friends in academic medicine is Andy Shore, who's the chief of pulmonary critical care medicine at MedStar here in DC. And, Andy is wired somewhat like me, so you have to understand our relationship, right? So I didn't take any offense. I thought it was hilarious when he told me the following joke. There's this tension between ID and critical care. He comes up to me, he says, there's two words in the English language that you can't say without saying the letters ID, stupid and idiot. No, in fact, we don't do very well on stewardship at all. If you go into almost any hospital in this country, we do horribly on stewardship, even hospitals where there's a strong ID presence. Now, I actually think the critical care people are worse, but, what are you going to do? Ed Septimus is leading an effort, or has led an effort, or is still leading an effort through the NQF to get a validated measure through CMS where we can do pay-for-performance public reporting of antibiotic use across healthcare systems. This is a riff off of what has worked so effectively for healthcare-associated infections. If we start publicly reporting people's antibiotic use and paying hospitals differently if they overuse or use appropriately, that's going to have a huge effect on stewardship. In the context of legislation around incentives, what we need to do is make sure that the label reflects how we want the drug to be used and stop approving drugs for things we don't want them to be used for just to get them on the market so I can intentionally use them off-label for what I do want them to be used for. Because marketing drives physician use of drugs. There's a reason why companies spend way more money every year marketing their drugs than they do investing R&D dollars to discovering new ones. We need to control the label. It's not because doctors know what's in the label, they don't. But companies market based on the label, and doctors know what companies market. So if we could, in this legislation, make the label accurate, focused on what we want the drug used for, not what's convenient to get it to market, that will have a huge beneficial impact to stewardship.
Just wanted to reply to 3 things that have come up. So I couldn't agree with Brad more about the importance of the label, and this is why IDSA has been pushing very hard for the LPAD legislation that would not only streamline the clinical trials for antibiotics that address an unmet need, but then those drugs would be approved for a limited population with very narrow indications on the label. And again, companies would only be able to market to what's on the label. And this is something that it's passed the House. We're doing everything we can to get it through the Senate by the end of this year. On stewardship, our big focus has been around the CMS condition of participation for all acute care hospitals, because we know that hospitals that have official stewardship programs in place do better on stewardship than the ones that don't. And we, again, we're urging CMS to finalize that before the end of this year as well. And I'm glad that you mentioned, Mark, not only stewardship, but also manufacturing reliability, because nearly every day I hear from an IDSA member somewhere in the country about an anti-infective drug shortage. This is a persistent problem. I know it's something that FDA has been working on for several years, but we believe a lot more needs to be done in this area. We actually worked with the EIN to conduct a study earlier this year and found that this problem has been growing in the last few years. And one of the key effects of antimicrobial drug shortages are that physicians are using broader spectrum antibiotics when they can't get a hold of the antibiotic that they want. And that's obviously the exact opposite of what we want to see for stewardship. So if there's a way that we can build manufacturing reliability into these incentives, I think that would be very important to do.
Okay. Important issue, and I'm sure we'll come back to that too. I do want to open this up to a broader discussion with the group, but with all the participants here. But just one more question before we do that. You all, I think, Amanda, in your opening comments, you said that this proposal was not getting serious consideration, despite having bipartisan legislative sponsors, despite being in the early stages of the 21st Century Cures legislation. I'd like to, so we're going to shift a little bit more into politics and political feasibility here, but would like your thoughts on whether that's still the case, whether it's likely to remain the case. Any of you on the panel about that? But Amanda, you can start.
Sure. I think some of this comes back to a point that Brad made earlier, that people don't always know who's paying for what, and there was this perception, how founded it was in fact remains up for debate, but certainly a perception that this type of an incentive would raise drug costs for whatever group of patients was taking the drug that would be getting this exclusivity voucher. So you want to keep it within the infectious disease space. There's been a huge outcry among patients with hepatitis C around access to new drugs there. If one of these new hepatitis C drugs were to get increased exclusivity and that extended this access problem, I think that certainly would be a big political challenge. I think we're all probably still processing the results of this election and what exactly this means for how worried
I'm not going to ask you that question. There probably hasn't been enough time for people to process, but about all the political implications.
I think on the flip side, there is still the big concern, the big bipartisan concern about the need for antibiotic incentives, and I think it's kind of our task to make that the bigger concern and tell, the kinds of stories that patients like Tatiana and that ID doctors are seeing every day to kind of build that political will.
I'm not going to touch politics because Amanda knows far more about the landscape than I will ever know or want to know. But I will point out that, again, both as a treating clinician, as a hospital administrator, I don't think it's shocking news to people that the pharmaceutical industry is not the public's favorite. It ranks right up there with gun manufacturers and tobacco companies. The political hill to climb in the United States, probably different from Europe, I think, as you mentioned, Barrett. The political hill to climb to have incentives that the public thinks, rightly or wrongly, perception is reality, are going to favor pharma. Good luck. That's all I can say. I hear it from my patients.
That's a major challenge. I think everyone in this room sees also the antibiotic crisis that's here and growing larger. I don't think Capitol Hill sees that. They're a very, very reactive body. They love low-hanging fruit, and they're typically only really active when major crises are here. The slow drumbeat of deaths and infections and resistance levels growing is not necessarily getting their attention to that strong degree. So to get a major piece of legislation passed with a major incentive, it requires tremendous political willpower, and I think that's where, as a community, we can all come together and support some level of a shot in the arm, because we know the crisis, the docs know the crisis, our patients are seeing the crisis, but the Hill isn't necessarily there just yet. So that behooves all of us to get more involved. It's a challenge, though. Like you said, the drug industry is not very popular right now, but also the drug manufacturers have other issues. They got other fish to fry. I got other things to be doing, too. So it's a challenge for us to devote the required amount of time to this situation. I think it's probably the most impactful kind of policy that I'm working on personally right now, most beneficial to sort of mankind. And so I'm very eager to continue in this space, and I hope you all can work together and with us and with each other to see what we can do over these next few years. The drug price situation is going to get a bit better, though, with this new Congress and the new administration. I hope the level of antagonism is going to decrease and quit everyone pointing their cans at the drug industry being for blame for all these problems. So maybe things are a bit better next year in Congress, but the challenge is in terms of costs, in terms of political capital, in terms of the crisis, and not really being there are going to be the major hindrances to substantial policy.
Bob?
Well, I won't speak to the issue of whether or not the issue of drug prices is going to calm down next year, but we shall see. Let's have coffee in about 6 months and talk about that. But it really would be helpful, though, to hear more about the guardrails, and I think that's the structuring around this is critically important to getting and building any kind of buy-in or even a conversation in this area. I mean, I've heard in the past from some of the folks who've considered this that, for example, biologicals would be carved out. It would not be part of this. So the hepatitis C drugs that you're referring to, it would not be, because there's already tremendous controversy around the length of exclusivity that biologicals have that keep biosimilars off the market, currently 12 years. That is there's been a lot of debate about that particular issue. So that's certainly one
That's
of
a good one, yeah.
Perhaps low-hanging fruit that could be carved out immediately. But there probably are others, and so it's important to hear what those who are pushing this kind of incentive have in mind as far as those carve-outs.
Sure. So, I mean, I'm happy to start sharing more of our draft, which we're calling the Revamped Act, Revitalizing Antimicrobial Products. So I do think that's an appropriate guardrail to carve out biologics, to not reopen that situation of 12 years of exclusivity for biologics. The other ones I talked about before were making sure that the entire marketplace in the generic world understands far in advance on which products are going to be use this kind of voucher. This conveyance award. I don't use the word voucher. Some sort of time frame is considered. So I think and that number is very critical, right? So Professor Alderson in the ERG report, as well as the UK AMR review, and others have all said you need about $1 billion, 800 million to 1.3 range to really provide that level of incentive per drug. And so when you map that out, you're trying to you want this award to be provided and used on a drug that is a blockbuster, frankly. So you are rewarding a blockbuster, because only a blockbuster is able to provide the upfront cost to the actual manufacturer of these antibiotics in an appropriate level. So that calculation is difficult to do, but it comes down to the time value of money and then the time value of that exclusivity extension. So it can't be too much, can't be too little. So what is that sweet spot? And you are measuring it far in advance. That's probably economically, that's the most difficult part of this kind of bill, is discounted cash flows and the time value of money and how to get the upfront cost for a product used 10 years from now. That's the challenge here. That's an appropriate guardrail. I'd like to have that conversation in greater terms. I'm sure the policymakers will have a very large degree to play in that one. I think it's also important. I think the best guardrail really is the eligibility process, ensuring that it works most appropriately, that it's reviewed on a consistent basis, that it is flexible in its own right, and works with the marketplace and with science.
Thank you all for a great discussion so far. I do want to broaden this now. For those in the room, there are microphones on the table. If you have a question or comment, just raise your hand, and when I call on you, let me know who you are. And for those of you who are on the webcast, remember, tweet to @DukeMargolis if you've got a question. Back here.
Hi, my name is Christine Ordahl. I work for the Norwegian Institute of Public Health. I'm a co-lead for Drive AB. Thank you. This has been a very interesting discussion and presentation. I think there's two main drawbacks from this incentive that maybe haven't really been touched upon. In Drive AB, we've been looking at the time frame that you pay out an incentive. So, for example, market entry rewards, which Kevin Otterson's going to talk about next, we've decided that it's probably not best to pay out in one lump sum payment. You want to spread your risk, not only because it's a large sum of money, but also because we're looking at antibiotics coming onto the market from small trials, and there could be side effects, and they might have to be withdrawn from the market. And there's a major drawback here that you could be giving this transferable patent exclusivity to a product that's immediately withdrawn from the market within the first year. So I'm curious about what your thoughts are there, because that would, of course, have a huge influence on public perception. And also, I think, of course, we're all shocked from the election last night, but there is this, I think that if you're looking at a large number of uninsured coming back into the American market, this can have implications on patient access to pharmaceuticals.
Okay. Not everybody needs to respond to every question. I also advised them that they were not going to be expected to do a complete interpretation of last night's election results either. I think we're still early on in that process. But reactions or comments?
That's a good one. I haven't thought about the whole, if the antibiotic is withdrawn, but the license, the award is already sort of provided and it's already sold, what happens? That's a good one. We'll have to work on that.
I mean, I think that would be interesting to think about structuring that in a way that there's a third party that would get the payment from the company that buys the voucher, or might buy a voucher, if that's the scenario that plays out, that money would go into escrow and then perhaps go to the company that's developed the antibiotic over a period of time. And that's one way of helping to make sure that they stay on the market for, so perhaps over a period of 10 years, there's 10 allotments of that money. But then again, that money becomes less valuable over time as well.
Yeah, Barrett's going to work on it.
Yeah, so I'm glad you're not going to ask for comments on the election. There isn't enough Pepto-Bismol in the world, so I'm not going to comment on that. Again, the question is, what are we incentivizing? What is it we want to incentivize? I would argue that if we want to incentivize discovery, and a company actually discovers a new scaffold and brings it to market 13 years later, and it fails a year later, it's still worth it. During the discovery process, they've discovered a new scaffold, which can be riffed off of for decades to come. So what are we incentivizing? On the other hand, if we're incentivizing late-stage acquisition, yeah, I would agree with you. That's a boondoggle. Really, we need to think, what is this incentive going to be used for? Because what I want is discovery, not late-stage acquisition.
We're here.
Ed Septimus, I'm going to ask you about something entirely different and maybe out of scope, but often developed by pharma in a prevention mode. What about immunizations?
There's been a debate in the past about vaccines and some vaccines not being, or most vaccines not being eligible for gain. I do think vaccines should be eligible for this kind of model of conveyance. I don't think, obviously, you can apply them to a vaccine, but it's a new space. I am not a medical officer. I understand there's great work underway in the vaccine space, and I think that would be a valuable kind of prophylactic, whether it's pre-surgical or in the course of some sort of treatment, perhaps for others, for transplants or something like this. So happy to incentivize that if that vaccine is for a critical need infection and can truly demonstrate the level of efficacy that the physician community wants.
Yeah, on this one, I'm going to have to go a different direction. If you're talking passive vaccine to treat an infection, we'd have to get past the biological issue. The economics around vaccine discovery and development are vastly different. And the same companies that have gotten out of antibacterial discovery and development have actually opened immune groups and vaccine groups. Pfizer is a great example of a company that has an active vaccine program that got out of small molecule discovery. So I don't think, personally, that these incentives should apply to vaccines. Vaccines are not having the same economic challenges.
Yeah, I would just mention, I don't know if you know this, Ed, but the President's Advisory Council on CARB, combating antibiotic-resistant bacteria, has created work groups in the area of therapeutics, vaccines or preventatives, and diagnostics. So they are exploring what incentives might be appropriate in each of those buckets.
Amanda?
So I would just say, obviously, IDSA certainly recognizes the tremendous value of vaccines and the need for more research in this area, and there obviously are unmet needs for vaccines. But I think Brad's right, the economics are completely different. And I can't say incentives aren't needed, but I think that we probably need to step back and do a more wholesale comprehensive look at vaccine R&D and where are the problems and where are the gaps and what are the right policies to fix that, because I think it could wind up looking very different for what we're doing for antibiotics. I feel like we're further down the line on antibiotics, and there's such an urgent need there that I hope we can make progress on antibiotics in the areas where we've got some ideas that are more close to being fully baked while we start working on vaccines, rather than kind of waiting for them to catch up.
The marketplace for outpatient vaccines is vastly different. The marketplace for inpatient vaccines, should there ever be one, is quite similar to inpatient antibiotics. So if there is in the future, if there's some magical inpatient vaccine that would be beneficial, I don't see why, and it meets the criteria of the critical need group. Are you okay?
No, the science is different, and I suppose the payer mechanism is somewhat different. But there are economic forces that would make someone like me say, hey, if you can bring in a vaccine that drops my C. diff rate, I will pay a lot of money for that.
Yeah, sure.
Time for one more. Kevin?
Thank you, Mark. Kevin Alderson, Boston University. I like the discussion of guardrails, but one guardrail that I think is important, but I didn't hear you talk about, is a dollar cap. And if anyone could comment on that, please.
So a revenue cap is definitely one that we've discussed. It's challenging. And so going back to our whole principal issues of working with Congress, having a revenue cap in legislation is probably a big no-no. For either party right now, that it's the drug pricing climate is so difficult and challenging of its own right, to have legislation that in a precedent level setting would have a cap in revenue could be more of a detractor than something to be beneficial. Maybe we get there. I don't know. I think the best way to do that, though, is looking at the amount of exclusivity and the time that's rewarded for a product of this magnitude. It's not perfect. It's not going to be as direct as a revenue cap, but it's probably better in terms of setting the precedent for future legislation.
Any other comments? All right. Want to thank our panelists for an excellent discussion of this first phase of today's meeting on pull incentives or economic incentives for bringing antimicrobials to market in these highly needed areas. Thank you all for the time and effort this morning.